I drove 4 hours to tell her something. I had the whole speech prepared. I had been preparing it in various drafts for about 3 weeks, which is embarrassing to admit because the speech was not long. It was maybe 4 sentences, but 4 sentences that mean something require considerably more preparation than 4 sentences that don't, and these meant something, and I had gotten them exactly right somewhere around the 2-hour mark of the drive. Somewhere on the long flat stretch of highway where the sky opens up and there's nothing to look at except the road and your own thoughts, which is either the best or worst place to finalize something important depending on the day. By the time I pulled into her street, I had the 4 sentences so thoroughly committed to memory that I could have said them backwards. I parked the car. I sat there for approximately 90 seconds. I walked to her door, I knocked. She opened the door and said it first. Not my 4 sentences. Her own version of the same thing, which was shorter than mine and more direct than mine, and arrived with the casual confidence of someone who had not spent 3 weeks rehearsing and had simply decided that today was the day to say it. She looked at me standing on her porch, said what she said, and then looked at my face, which must have done something she didn't expect, because she stopped mid-word and said, "Wait, were you coming here to say something?" I said, "I drove 4 hours." She said, "You drove 4 hours." I said, "I had a speech." She looked at me for a moment and then she laughed. Not at me, or not only at me, but at the specific shape of what had just happened. The way two people can be moving toward the same point from opposite directions and arrive at exactly the same instant without either of them knowing the other was on the road. I stood on her porch with my 4 sentences still memorized and completely unnecessary, and I thought, this is either the best or worst thing that has ever happened to me. And then I thought, no, it's the best. It is definitively and completely the best. Her name is Clara Park. She is 31 years old, and she works as a marine biologist at a research station on the coast, which is why she lives 4 hours from the city where I live and work, and which is the central logistical fact of everything that happened between us from the beginning. I'm 33. I manage a small team of environmental consultants for a firm that does impact assessments for coastal development projects, which is how we met 18 months ago at a conference on marine conservation that we were both attending for professional reasons, and that we both found slightly insufferable in different ways that turned out to be compatible. I found it insufferable because of the way the policy panels kept circling the same 3 solutions without committing to any of them. She found it insufferable because of the catering, specifically because the catering had committed the crime of serving smoked salmon at a marine biology conference with a level of irony that nobody else seemed to register. She said this to the person standing next to her at the buffet table, who happened to be me, and I said, I had the same thought, but I didn't know if it was appropriate to say it. And she said, if you can't say it to a stranger at a buffet table who is also clearly annoyed, when can you say it? And I said that was a fair point. And we stood at the buffet table for 40 minutes talking about irony and marine policy, and the specific variety of conference fatigue that sets in around the 3rd panel of the 2nd day. And by the end of it, I understood that I had just met someone I was going to want to know for a long time. The problem was the 4 hours. It is not an insurmountable distance, 4 hours. It is the kind of distance that is completely manageable if both people want to manage it, which is a sentence I said to myself several times in the 18 months that followed, and which was, each time I said it, both true and slightly beside the point. Because the managing of it required something I kept finding reasons to delay, which was the direct acknowledgement that there was something to manage. Clara and I had been, for 18 months, the kind of friends who talked on the phone more than either of us talked to people we saw regularly, who remembered the things the other one mentioned in passing and asked about them later, who sent each other articles and photographs and occasionally audio messages at unreasonable hours when something was funny or interesting enough to not wait until a reasonable one. We were the kind of friends who, when we did see each other at a second conference, 8 months after the first, at a work event she drove up for, at 2 separate occasions, when I had project-related reasons to be near the coast, talked until the reason for ending the conversation had passed, and then talked for another hour after that. We were, by any reasonable external assessment, the kind of friends who were clearly something more than that and were waiting for one of them to say so. I was the one doing the waiting. I should be precise about that. Clara, I learned later, had been aware of what we were for considerably longer than I had been willing to be, and had been patient about it in the way she was patient about things, which was not passively, but strategically, not waiting for me to catch up so much as giving me the specific kind of space a person needs to arrive at their own conclusions rather than being handed them. She said, when I asked her about this much later, that she had decided early on that telling me what I felt before I knew I felt it would only make me doubt it, and that I was the kind of person who needed to find the thing himself, rather than be shown where it was. I said, "That is a very accurate read of a flaw I didn't know I had." She said, "It's not a flaw." I said, "It took me 18 months." She said, "Some things take the time they take," and she said it without any edge, which told me she had genuinely meant the patience and not merely performed it, which was the kind of thing about her that made the 4-hour drive worth it. The 3 weeks before I drove down had started with a phone call, not a remarkable phone call by any of our standards, which by that point included phone calls about climate modeling and Pacific current shifts, and a long one in March about whether the particular variety of loneliness that comes from working near the ocean but not being from a coastal place was meaningfully different from other varieties, which is the kind of conversation that could only happen between two people who had stopped performing casualness with each other without quite naming what had replaced it. The phone call 3 weeks before the drive was on a Tuesday evening, which was not our usual day, and it started with her telling me about a seal colony survey she had done that morning. 3 hours in a Zodiac and chop that she described with the understated competence of someone who had done it 100 times and still found it genuinely wonderful. And it ended somewhere around 11 with one of those silences that happen between people who are comfortable with silence. A silence that went on long enough that I noticed it and she noticed it and neither of us filled it. And then she said, "I should probably sleep." And I said, "Yeah." And there was another silence. And then she said good night in a voice that was slightly different from her usual good night. And I said good night, and I held the phone for a moment after the call ended and thought, something is going to have to be said about this. It took me 3 weeks to figure out the 4 sentences. I spent the first week not figuring them out, but pretending to, by approaching the problem from various indirect angles, which included reading things I didn't need to read, reorganizing my workspace, and having 2 conversations with my friend Marcus that were ostensibly about other things but were structurally about this. Marcus, to his credit, identified what was happening immediately and waited for me to catch up, which I did on the second conversation when I said, "Okay, I need to say something to Clara." And he said, "I know." And I said, "I'm going to drive down." And he said, "Finally." And I said, "What do you mean, finally?" And he said, "Owen, I've been watching you not do this for 18 months. And I said, "My name is not Owen." And he said, "I know. I'm just saying it's been a while." The second week, I wrote approximately 11 versions of the 4 sentences and discarded them all for different reasons. Mostly because they were either too much or not enough, or said the true thing in a way that left room for it not to be received as the true thing, which was a risk I was not willing to take. The third week I got it right, and then I booked the Friday off work, and then I got in the car. I want to tell you about the drive because it mattered in a way I didn't expect. 4 hours is a long time to be alone with a decision you've already made. And what I found, somewhere around the second hour, was that I was not anxious in the way I had expected to be. I had expected the specific performance anxiety of someone about to say something that cannot be unsaid, the kind that makes the hands sweat on the wheel and the mind rehearse worst cases. Instead, I found something closer to clarity, which is rarer for me than I would like, and which I recognized immediately, because I had experienced it maybe 4 or 5 times in my life, and it always arrived in the same way, quietly and without announcement, like a room that has been dark and then is simply light. I knew what I was going to say, and I knew why I was saying it, and I knew that whatever happened when I got there, the saying of it was the right thing. 4 hours of driving is, as it turns out, an excellent way to confirm that you mean something, because there is nothing to do for 4 hours except mean it or turn around, and I did not turn around. She lives in a small house at the end of a residential street about 10 minutes from the research station, the kind of house that looks like it was built by someone who understood that the person living in it would spend most of their time outdoors and needed the indoors to be simple and functional and full of light. There are 3 large windows in the living room that face the garden, and in the evenings in certain seasons, the light comes through them at an angle that makes the whole room turn amber, which I knew because I had been in that house twice before, once for a weekend in the autumn when I had driven down for what I had told myself was a reasonable visit between friends, and once in January for a reason I have since forgotten because the reason was not the real reason, and the real reason was that I had wanted to be in that house with that light coming through those windows. Watching her move through her own life with the ease and the focus that characterized everything she did, I knew her house. I knew the mug she used for tea in the mornings, the dark blue one with a small chip on the rim that she refused to throw away because it had been her grandmother's. I knew that she kept her field notebooks in a stack on the second shelf of the bookcase in the order she had used them chronologically, so she could find any entry within 30 seconds. I knew that she made coffee too strong and ran 5 kilometers most mornings, and had a genuine and specific love for weather that most people would find inhospitable. I knew a great number of things about Clara Park, and I was 4 hours into the consequence of having finally admitted that knowing them all felt like the most important project of my adult life. I knocked. She opened the door, and she said it first. What she said was this: "I've been thinking about something, and I need to say it before I talk myself out of it again." She said this with her hand still on the door handle, not quite fully opening the door yet, as if she wanted to say the thing before the seeing of me made the saying of it more complicated. She said, "I think what this is between us is something I want to stop being careful about." She said, "I know the 4 hours is a problem, and I know we've both been pretending it isn't one, and I think I'm done pretending." She looked at me then, fully, and she said, "I think I'm in love with you, and I've been in love with you for a while, and I'm sorry it took me this long to just say it like that." And then she stopped and looked at my face and said, "Wait. Were you coming here to say something?" I said, "I drove 4 hours." She said, "You drove 4 hours to say something." I said, "I had a speech. 4 sentences. I had them exactly right somewhere around the Millbrook exit." She looked at me for a moment. Her expression did several things in quick succession: surprise and amusement, and something quieter behind both of them, the expression of someone who has just received confirmation of something they hoped was true, but had kept the hope at a careful distance in case it wasn't. She said, "What were the 4 sentences?" I said, "They were a version of what you just said." She said, "But in your order." I said, "Yes, in my order," which took considerably longer to arrive at. She said, "How long?" I said, 3 weeks and 4 hours, roughly. She laughed then, the laugh I knew well enough to have an internal catalog of, the one that started small and became genuine, the one that meant she was surprised and pleased and not performing either. She stepped back from the door the way you step back from a door when you've decided that what's on the other side should come in. I came in. The house was exactly as I had known it would be. The afternoon light was doing what the afternoon light did through those 3 windows, turning the room amber in the way I had driven 4 hours half thinking about. The dark blue mug was on the kitchen counter. The field notebooks were on the second shelf. She had been working on something at the table near the window, a survey chart of some kind, which she closed when she sat down across from me, and we sat in that amber room, and I told her the 4 sentences in order, which felt necessary even though she had said the same thing first and better, because they were mine and I had worked on them and she deserved to hear them. She listened to all 4 without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "You drove 4 hours to say that." I said, "I did." She said, "You could have called." I said, "I know. I wanted to say it where you could see me." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's actually one of the best things anyone has said to me." I said, "I had more time to prepare." She said, "You had 3 weeks and 4 hours." I said, 4 hours is a long time." She said, "What did you think about?" I said, "Whether I meant it." She said, "And?" I said, "I meant it before I got in the car." The 4 hours just made me sure of being sure. She made coffee, too strong as always, and we sat in the amber room and talked for 3 hours, not about the 4 sentences specifically, but about everything adjacent to them. The 18 months and the conference and the salmon and the Tuesday phone call and the January visit and the distance, which we talked about honestly and without pretending it was simple, because it isn't simple and we are both people who prefer accurate maps to comfortable ones. The distance is 4 hours. She has a research position that is geographically fixed for at least 2 more years, and probably longer if the station gets the funding it is applying for. I have a job that is not geographically fixed, but that is geographically convenient where it currently is. These are real facts that require real decisions, and we acknowledge them as real facts without letting them be the ceiling of the conversation, because the ceiling of the conversation was not the logistics. The ceiling of the conversation was what we had just said to each other, which was not small, and which did not require the logistics to be solved before it could be true. At some point in the late afternoon, she said, "You're going to have to drive back tonight." I said, "I know." She said, "That's 8 hours of driving in one day." I said, "I've had worse days." She looked at me with an expression I recognized, but that was slightly more exposed than I was used to seeing. The expression she wore when something had landed precisely where she had hoped it would, and she had not yet rearranged her face back into its usual composure. She said, "You could stay." I said, "I didn't bring anything." She said, "I have a spare toothbrush." I looked at her. She looked at me. The amber light had shifted to the late afternoon version of itself, softer, and the room was very quiet in the way of a place that is far enough from the city that quiet is its natural state rather than an absence of something. I said, "Are you sure?" She said, "I drove to the city in January for a reason I told myself was work. You drove 4 hours today for a reason you told yourself needed 4 sentences. I think we're past asking each other if we're sure." That was the most accurate thing anyone had said to me in a long time, and I told her so, and she said, "I've had 18 months to think about what to say to you," which made me laugh, which made her smile, and the room held both of those sounds for a moment in the amber light. I stayed. I called Marcus that evening from the garden while Clara was inside, because he was the only person who knew where I was and why, and because he would otherwise spend the weekend mildly concerned. He answered on the second ring and said, "So?" I said, "She said it first." He said, "She said it first." I said, "Before I even got the speech out." He laughed in the way people laugh when something has confirmed a prediction they had held for a long time and never quite voiced. He said, "What did you do?" I said, "I told her the 4 sentences anyway." He said, "Of course you did." I said, "She needed to hear them." He said, "And?" I said, "She said it was one of the best things anyone had said to her." Marcus was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Good. Just good." And I stood in the garden of Clara's small house at the end of her residential street, 4 hours from the city where I lived, looking at the light that was now the evening version of itself, darker and cooler. And I thought about something Clara had said during the 3 hours of conversation, which was that the thing about the ocean is that it is always moving toward something even when it appears to be still, that the visible surface and the actual motion are not always the same thing, and that most of what matters in her work is learning to read the difference. I had not, at the time, said out loud that this was also a description of the past 18 months of my life as they related to her. I thought it. I filed it for later. She probably already knew. We have been, since that Friday, doing the thing we should have started doing considerably earlier, which is being honest about what this is and managing the 4 hours as the real logistical fact it is, rather than the reason not to start. It is not easy. I want to be clear that it is not easy, because stories about distance often make the distance sound like a backdrop rather than a protagonist, and in our story the distance is a protagonist. It requires planning. It requires the specific discipline of 2 people who both have demanding jobs and complicated schedules deciding repeatedly that the thing between them is worth the inconvenience of the distance, which it is, and which both of us know it is, and which neither of us pretends is not inconvenient. What it also requires, and what I have found I am better at than I knew, is the particular kind of presence that comes from not being able to take proximity for granted. When I am in that house with those 3 windows and that amber light, I know exactly where I am. I am there on purpose, at the cost of 4 hours each way, which turns out to be an excellent way to be somewhere fully. Clara told me, 3 months after the Friday, that she had almost called me the week before she said it first. She said she had picked up the phone twice on the Monday and put it down both times, and that she had decided by Tuesday that if she was going to do it at all, she was going to do it in person, which meant she was going to have to wait until I came to her, or she came to me, and that she had given herself a deadline of the end of the month. She said she had not expected me to show up at her door with a prepared speech on the Friday of the 3rd week. I said, "I didn't know you were about to do it too." She said, "I know. That's what made it funny." I said, "It made it more than funny." She said, "Yes." And she looked at me with the same expression I had seen on her porch that first afternoon, the one that was more exposed than her usual composure, the one she had stopped rearranging away. And I thought about 4 hours of highway, with the sky opening up, and 4 sentences committed to memory, and a door opening before I could knock twice, and a woman who said the same thing I had come to say but in her order and better. And I thought that the best things, the actual best things, are the ones where you both arrive at the door at the same time and neither of you knew the other was coming. You don't need to be the one who gets there first. You just need to get there. I still have the 4 sentences memorized. I don't think I'll forget them. They were mine, worked on for 3 weeks and confirmed over 4 hours of flat highway, and they were true, and I said them and she heard them, and that is enough. She said it first. I said it better prepared. Between the two of us, we got the whole thing said, which is more than most people manage, and which is, I think, exactly what the 18 months were for. There is a version of this story where I tell you the logistics worked out neatly, and the distance stopped being 4 hours, and everything aligned itself into a simpler shape, and that version would be easier to tell and less true. The truth is that the logistics are still complicated, and still require the specific kind of ongoing commitment that people usually don't describe when they describe being in love with someone, because the ongoing commitment is less romantic sounding than the 4-hour drive and the 4 sentences in the amber room, but it is also the actual substance of what love is, when it becomes a practice rather than a declaration. I drive down most second weekends. She drives up on the alternating ones, except when the survey schedule or the tides make that impossible, which happens more than you would think because the ocean does not organize itself around relationship logistics, which she told me at the conference and which I have since confirmed empirically. We have developed, over these months, the specific repertoire of 2 people who have agreed that the 4 hours is a cost they are both willing to pay and who have stopped pretending that this agreement is something other than what it is, which is a choice, made repeatedly, to show up. The Tuesday phone calls have changed. They are not different in length or frequency, but they are different in the way you can hear in someone's voice when the thing they are saying is the thing they mean, and not a careful version of it. I am better at saying the true thing directly than I was 18 months ago, which is entirely her influence, applied with the patience of someone who understood that influence of that kind cannot be rushed. She is, if anything, slightly less direct than she was, which I take as a compliment because it suggests that the things she is saying to me now are things she has considered rather than things she has decided to discharge before she loses her nerve. We have, in other words, both moved toward the middle in a way that is almost certainly better than either of our defaults. She will not tell me that, but she has said, on 2 separate occasions, that talking to me is easier than it used to be, which from Clara Park is the equivalent of a sonnet. Marcus asked me, last month, when I was going to do something about the 4 hours, by which he meant, I understood, whether either of us was going to move. I said, "We're talking about it." He said, "You've been talking about things for 18 months. I said, "Yes, but now the things we're talking about are real," and he accepted this, because Marcus is the kind of friend who knows when something has changed, even when the external facts look similar. The external facts do look similar. I still live in the city. Clara still lives 4 hours away, at the end of a residential street, 10 minutes from a research station, where she spends her days counting seal populations and reading ocean currents, and thinking about the things that are happening below the visible surface of the water, which is most of what matters. We are still technically 4 hours apart. But the 4 hours has a different quality now than it did when we were using it as a reason rather than describing it as a fact. A reason keeps you still. A fact is just a thing you know about the road. What I did not tell Marcus, because it was still new enough that saying it felt like it might change its shape, was that we had talked, the previous weekend, about what it might look like in 2 years. Not as a plan, not with dates or decisions attached to it, but as a direction, which is what 2 people who are both planners and both wary of false certainty talk about when they want to acknowledge that they can see a future without claiming to have mapped it. Clara had said, carefully and without looking at me, that she was not interested in being 4 hours away from you indefinitely, and I had said, good, because I'm not interested in that either. And we had left it there, in the room, without needing to say anything else about it yet. The room had held it the way that Amber Room held things, quietly and with good light. I drove home on the Sunday of that weekend in the same direction I had driven 4 months earlier, the same long, flat stretch of highway where the sky opens up. It was late afternoon, and the light was doing what late afternoon light does on that road in autumn, coming in low and sideways and making everything along the highway edge look deliberate and specific. I thought about a research station on the coast, and a woman who counts seals and reads ocean currents and says the true thing directly, and had the patience to wait for me to find the same words she had already found. I thought about the 4 sentences I had worked on for 3 weeks, and about how she had beaten me to them by 4 seconds and 3 weeks of her own private preparation, and about how the arriving at the same moment is something neither of us could have arranged, and both of us, I think, needed it to be. I thought about the Tuesday night silence and the Monday phone she picked up and put down twice, before deciding she would do it in person. I thought about the Millbrook exit and what the clarity had felt like when it arrived, and I thought that whatever comes next, the conversations and the decisions and the 2 years and the direction that is not yet a plan, whatever comes next is something we are both moving toward with the specific quality of intention that comes from having already driven 4 hours to confirm that you mean it. I drove home. I called her when I got in. She answered on the first ring, which she almost never does because she is usually in the middle of something, and she said, "You're home," and I said, "Yes," and she said, "Good," and I said, "I know." And there was a silence that was not the Tuesday silence, but something related to it. The silence of 2 people who have stopped filling every space with words because they trust what lives in the space between them. Then she said, "I've been looking at the drive time from the station to the city," and I said, "How long?" And she said, 3 hours 40 if you leave by 6, and I said, "That's better than 4. And she said, "I know." And I said, "You've been looking at it for a while." And she said, "I've been looking at it for about 3 weeks. And I said, "I'm starting to recognize that timeline." And she laughed the laugh that starts small and becomes genuine. And I heard it through the phone in my apartment 4 hours away. And I thought, 3 weeks is exactly how long it takes for something to become a decision. I know this about both of us now. We are, it turns out, on the same schedule. We always were. We just needed the 4 hours to find out. The next time I drive down, I will not have a speech prepared. This is new for me, the not preparing, which Clara has identified as a sign of progress, and which I experience as a slightly vertiginous freedom. I used to think preparation was the opposite of risk, that if you had the right words in the right order, the thing you were saying couldn't go wrong. What I understand now, having said the right words in the right order to someone who had already said them, is that preparation is not the opposite of risk. It is just the form that care takes in people who express care by working on things. Clara expresses care by paying attention. I express care by preparing. Between the 2 of us, we have covered the thing from every angle, which is, she told me once, the scientific method applied to being in love, and which I told her was either the most romantic or least romantic thing anyone had said to me, and she said, with complete sincerity, that she didn't see the difference, and I said, "I know." And that was the moment I was most certain I had found the right person, which is a sentence I had never expected to think at any point in my life, and which arrived, like most of the important things, quietly and without announcement, on the long, flat stretch of the drive home. She called me last Tuesday, not on our usual day, which is how the last one that mattered started, and she said, "I've been thinking." I said, "That's either good or requires coffee." She said, "Probably both." She said she had a conversation with her station director about remote work arrangements for the analytical component of her role, which is a portion of what she does that does not require her to be physically at the coast, and that the director had been more open to it than she expected. She said this in the careful, factual way. She says things that are not yet decided, but are no longer entirely theoretical, and I heard in it the same quality I had heard in her voice when she said it first on the porch. The voice of someone who has been thinking about something for exactly 3 weeks. I said, "How much of the role is analytical?" She said, "About 40%, and in the winter months closer to 60 because the field surveys slow down." I said, 40 to 60% is not nothing." She said, "No, it's not nothing." There was a silence that was not the Tuesday silence, and not the one that lives between us on the phone now, but something newer, the silence of a direction becoming a shape. I said, You've been thinking about this for 3 weeks, she said. About 3 weeks, yes. I said, I recognize that timeline. She said, I know you do. We were quiet for a moment. Then she said, I'm not saying it's decided. I said, I know. She said, I'm saying I've been thinking about it. I said, that's the first step. She said, for both of us, it's usually the only step that matters. And she was right. She is almost always right about these things. About the way two particular people move through the world and toward each other. And I said, I know. And she said, good. And there it was again, the short sentence that contains everything. The compressed certainty that takes 3 weeks to arrive at, and 4 hours to confirm, and a lifetime to keep choosing, and which is, in the end, the whole story.